Hey YouTube, this is Robert Ness 816, and today I wanted to look into some of the hazards you can run into when buying retro game consoles. So since this stuff is usually around 25 to 30 years old, even older, it's going to have some history. So basically what I have here are two examples of systems that have been worked on by people, well, system and game that have been worked on by people or repaired by people who really should never have touched this stuff in the first place. So basically, when it comes down to it, I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube and other places where people say that using sandpaper is a good idea to clean up your games. That's probably the furthest thing from the truth, and it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. So here I have what appears to be a very clean copy of Arkanoid. You can see that the cartridge itself has really no wear from handling on it. The label's all nice and pretty. It's pretty much what you would look at as being a really good, a really nice copy as far as collecting goes. But if we open it up, we get a good example of why using sandpaper is so stupid. So here's a nice close-up of the Arkanoid cartridge that I showed you before. And you can see that this particular individual used sandpaper and it kind of wiped away the top layer of the PCB. So all this does is basically expose the circuit board to corrosion and anything else that can happen to it and basically ruin the game over time. Also what they've done is worn away the copper contacts, and that basically will pretty much greatly reduce the lifespan of this cartridge. So you can see in the back here just how much wear took place on this particular cartridge. So this game, it still works, but the overall lifespan of it has been greatly reduced. So unfortunately, this is a game that I'm stuck with. However, I did at least get it for a really good price. So it did come with the proper Arkanoid controller, which has a little knob on it, and at least that was in pretty much mint condition, and it also came with the manual and the case as well. So, you know, whatever. But yeah, so in the future I'm going to have to at least search out a very crappy looking copy of Arkanoid, and just pray that the board is in at least decent shape to replace this one. But like I said, the game still works fine, but this corrosion is just, it's really unacceptable. I mean, that corrosion, the wear on here is really unacceptable. So if we look on the cartridge itself, where was it? In the front here, you can actually see where someone used sandpaper or something even on the plastic. So after just showing you what sandpaper does to a video game cartridge, the Sega Genesis console is pretty much the same story. Again, somebody used sandpaper on this exit connector, and if I refocus again, you'll see just how much damage was done here. So looking at this connector, this entire thing should be covered in like a solder paste. So like the silver material here should be covering these pins, but unfortunately it has been worn away because, again, some idiot used sandpaper on this connector, and all that does is basically ruin the extension port here on this Genesis and pretty much limit its useful lifespan. So if I ever wanted to use the Sega CD on this peripheral, or on this Genesis I should say, I pretty much have to plug it in and leave it there permanently. So as you can see, I have actually used it on my Sega CD just to make sure it still works. But you can see the wear that has already taken place. And there's actually a whole lot more going on with this Genesis besides this connector. So this Genesis is actually a very early Genesis. It's a board VA3 revision, which means it's a non-security Genesis, or non-TMSS, I believe it is. And to collectors who are really into the Genesis, that's more or less a sought-after Genesis, because it's just before they put security coding in there, which means there's a couple of non-licensed games, or early non-licensed games, that will play on this, but won't work on other Genesis consoles unless you use a Game Genie, I'm thinking. But anyways, so cosmetically, if we look at it closer, it is in really nice condition. Never mind the fingerprints that are all over it, but you know, it's in really nice shape. So I actually did clean this one up. It was pretty dusty, which means that whoever touched this thing either fooled around with it years ago, or just someone got it recently and just didn't, you know, clean it up or whatever. So all the decals in this one are in really nice shape. The RF shielding and closer, or just looking at it, appears to be in good shape. I did not take off the port, so that was my fault, but I noticed that when I got home. And also when I took this console home and took it apart to clean it, again, that's where the obvious signs were right in front of my face, but I didn't see it. So there was 2 screws missing on this particular console, so the 2 middle screws were missing, so that's always a bad sign. So after taking out the other 4 screws, I took the console apart. I noticed that the 2 little prongs that hold in the LED light in the front. So with the Genesis, this light doesn't simply plug in. It's basically molded into the ring here, so it's in there permanently. There's 2 large prongs that stick out from the LED light, and the plug basically slides through those prongs, and those prongs get bent over the plug. So those prongs had obviously been tampered with, because you have to bend them back in order to take that plug off. So I noticed that. What else? The shielding on here was full of fingerprints, so those came off easy enough, not a big deal. The reason why I like taking the fingerprints off is because the oils from your skin can actually cause the metal to rust. So there was a glob of solder on the side of the shielding here, so immediately I was like, what the hell? So I thought that someone had maybe modified something inside of here, but it actually wasn't the case. So after taking the shielding off, it was full of like dust and dust bunnies and stuff like that. The 2 voltage regulators were covered with thermal paste, which I still struggle to understand the thinking behind that, but they were pretty much smeared around the outside of it, and it basically made me question what the fuck was this person thinking. Something else that was kind of funny was the screw posts here. So with the RF shielding on these consoles, they go right up to the screw posts, and the edges of those the RF shielding was actually bent down where the screw posts go into the shell. So whoever put this back together kind of forcibly put it back together. So again, how does that happen? What else? Oh, so besides the 2 voltage regulators being covered in thermal paste, there was also a problem with the power wires going to the console. So with the Genesis, you have your 9-volt in the back here, and then you have 2 wires running to the board, and someone actually cut those wires for some reason and attempted to put them back together by simply wrapping them up in duct tape. You know, again, what's their thinking? I don't understand that. Fire hazard, you know. So basically I looked excuse me, I looked over the board really good. I didn't see any type of replacement components on there, any type of modifications. Everything looked like it was done at the factory, so nothing appeared to be changed. So pretty much my whole goal then was to fix the wires. So I had some spare wire lying around, so I spliced in 2 pieces of wire there to basically extend them so that it properly made the length without being stretched over anything. There's 2 little wire holders that the wire fits into right here in the console, so I extended the wire so that it fit into those holders like it's supposed to. I put shrink tubing over those wires so it wouldn't short out anything, and basically it sort of kind of looks like no one was ever in there, although, you know, string tubing obviously tells that. As far as the glob of solder on here, I tried to suck off as much as I can. The only thing I have to remove solder is this solder sucker, so I don't actually have one of those little vacuum things. So after I got off as much as I could, I basically tried to kind of chip off whatever I could without damaging the shielding any further. So I did that, and then whatever else was on there, I kind of just smoothed out over the board, over the shielding, just so it would at least not come off at any future date and short anything out. So I pretty much repaired everything I could, cleaned the whole thing up as best I could, and hopefully, or thankfully I should say, the shell on this console is actually, cosmetically anyway, in really nice condition. There really aren't any defects in it. There's like a little ding back here, which I could really care less about. There's 2 little dings here, which again, you know, I'm nitpicking about, but for the most part, this whole entire console is in really nice shape. And also with these Genesis consoles, these bottom labels here, they usually get ripped up and stuff from using the Sega CD attachment. So that joining plate actually really does beat up the bottom of these consoles if the person doesn't really know how to use it. But thankfully these decals are all in nice shape, and the bottom of the console has no chips or anything in it. So, and it did come with the proper connector for it and the side cover. So if anything in the future, I would like to maybe find some type of solder paste. Put that back on. Some type of solder paste to put back on those pins to cover them up. But if not, then I'll just leave it the way it is, because this is more or less like a spare console. It's not my permanent one. At least the cartridge connector on this one was in really nice shape, and like I said, the rest of the board was pretty much perfect. So there are no bad caps on this particular board. The picture quality is really clean. The sound quality is great. Like I said, I looked over it. Didn't look like anyone touched anything in it, so I'm happy with that. Excuse me. So as far as cleaning up the voltage regulators, I pretty much removed all of the old thermal compound with 91% rubbing alcohol. Cleaned everything up. Cleaned off the heatsink. And on my other Genesis consoles, it did look like Sega used a little dab of thermal compound on the voltage regulators behind them. So I had some Arctic Silver laying around, so I've used Arctic Silver 5, which I use in my PC build. So I put like a small amount on both voltage regulators and then just screwed it back to the heatsink. So seems like it's fine. So yeah, I mean, I've played games on this thing for like 3 hours on end, and it's never let me down. So, and it definitely doesn't run hot or anything like that, at least any hotter than other Genesis consoles. So one last thing before I do go is that I forgot to mention, with the middle screws here on the bottom of the unit, I was able to replace these two middle screws here that were missing. So basically I was able to fill in the holes here with crazy glue, the screw posts anyway, on the top cover. I let that cure, and then I drilled a pilot hole that was basically a size smaller than the actual screw, and then I basically created new threads in the crazy glue after that. I also used screws that were slightly longer than the original, so this is one of the screws that I used in here in the middle. So the 4 side screws use the original screws, and then the 2 middle screws use these slightly longer ones. So I was able to at least save the top cover in trying to repair this console. So that's pretty much it. When you buy retro things, make sure you look at them top to bottom. And that's also why I hate paying full retail for things too, because you got to expect this stuff is 25 years old. There's always going to be a history behind everything that you buy, especially when it's this old. So I mean, granted, this stuff works, but it's not going to last in its current state. This will, except for the edge connector, as long as I don't keep sliding it in and out of a Sega CD. But yeah, this game right here is pretty much done for, and it sucks, but that's what happens sometimes. So always look after what you're buying and make sure that what you're getting at least wasn't touched. Because when I like to buy stuff, at least I like to be the first person that opened up the console or whatever, or the game. It just makes me feel better that at least I, for one, know what I'm cleaning up, and that's it.